The following presentation is controversial and may be offensive to some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I promise you it'll be well worth your time. This video is the culmination of several years of research which started out as a mere hobby. But it turned into something else. It took me a while to feel comfortable speaking about it, so I thank you all for listening. I'd like to jump in with a few questions. So how many of you feel that there are things going on in society and government that you feel you should probably know, but know that you don't? How many of you have ever had a feeling that certain man-made institutions are corrupt, but you go along with it because everyone else is too? How many of you feel that there are going to be major changes in the economic landscape of the United States in your lifetime? How about in the next 10 years? All right, so how about this one? Why did I make this video? Well, I think the best answer to show my motivation could be summed up in about 75 seconds with this.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Whoa. So why did I make this video? Well, for one, I got mad. And two, not only am I going to talk about things that I believe every American has the right to understand, but when I started learning about this stuff, I realized that less than 1% of the population actually does understand it. And I realized that I really want that to change. Now I understand that a lot of people don't want to know what's really going on. They believe that this stuff just doesn't impact them. Some feel it's too big for them, and that it's way over there somewhere. Some might even think that it's so complicated that they need a doctorate from Harvard to understand it. Well, I'm here to tell you that the stuff I'm going to reveal is right here and now stuff, that it's been affecting everyone our entire lives. It's not too big for anybody, and it's actually much simpler than some make it out to be. Some of you know that I wanted to give this presentation in person. I wanted to do a live presentation because I wanted to inform the people that I care about without going viral, because I lose my anonymity. And frankly, there are people in this world who, let's say, would prefer that people making videos on these subjects would go away. And in doing it anyways, I'm subjecting myself to certain attention that most would prefer to avoid, including myself. But I came to the conclusion that despite the risks, I have to do something. So here it is. Now this video is great because it allows you to watch it on your own terms. But unless you're watching this with somebody else, you don't get to have any dialogue with anyone. So that is the one downside to this video. But either way, the most important thing is I do not want you to take my word for it. I want you to take what I say and find out for yourself. Because if you really take the time to analyze how our society works and how it is structured, I am confident that what you will find will have much more meaning to you than anything I could say. That being said, I do feel that once you understand what I'm about to tell you, it's very possible that, like our friend in the video there, you may get mad. But more importantly, I would prefer you to get curious. Because once you know this, the news won't look the same, political debates won't look the same, and you'll be able to form your own opinions from a completely different perspective, one that they don't want you to know. And we are going to get into they later. Now, before I go any further, I have a confession to make. You should all know that I have opinions about the information I'm going to share, but I'm going to attempt to leave them out as much as possible and present the facts. At times when I can't help myself, I am going to expose it as an opinion as I present it, so that this doesn't turn into about what I think. Okay, so down to business. We're going to be covering certain topics, and the first one has to be the monetary system itself. Specifically, we're going to talk about how money is created, who controls it, and how it affects us all directly. Now, the reason we have to start with how money is created is because we have to know how money is created if we are to understand how it can be manipulated. Here is the Capitol building of Congress on the left and the Federal Reserve building on the right. The way our system in America works is since 1913, the government has partnered with an entity called the Federal Reserve. Now, what most people don't understand is the Federal Reserve is a privately owned corporation. They are incorporated in Delaware. This is not a government organization. They are allowed by our government to print and regulate our nation's money supply. Meaning the government gave them the authority and the means to expand or contract the literal amount of dollars in circulation. Now, if the Federal Reserve is giving money to the government, where does the Federal Reserve get the money? Well, all they do is create it out of thin air. They literally just print money. And at the same time, the government prints pieces of paper themselves and calls those treasury bonds. The government then gives this privately owned organization these treasury bonds that they created in exchange for the dollar bills that the Fed created. So the Federal Reserve buys these bonds from the government and in return gives the government the dollars, and the bonds are held by the Federal Reserve as government IOUs. Okay, in English, please. The government creates the bonds and gives them to the Federal Reserve. And giving them the bonds is simply a promise to repay the amount they get from the Fed. So they give the Federal Reserve the bonds in exchange for the dollar bills that are created by the Federal Reserve. But the dollar bills that are created by the Federal Reserve are created out of nothing and backed by absolutely nothing. And if you're still not with me, don't worry, we will revisit. Now, since this privately owned organization prints money out of thin air and does not have anything backing it other than a promise to repay from the government, that means that the Federal Reserve is not federal and there are no reserves. So question, why then do you think they decided to name it the Federal Reserve? The reason why the bankers chose the name Federal Reserve was an intentional deception, so that people would think they are part of the government. And I'll go into more detail on that later. But it gets worse. Because the Fed is a privately owned corporation, they operate for profit. So when they create the money out of thin air by hitting some zeros on the keyboard and hold the treasury bonds as government IOUs, they are allowed to charge interest on the money that they never even had to begin with. Thomas Edison said, if the U.S. can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. They both rest purely on the faith and credit of the United States government. So question, why would a government who has the constitutional power to print its own money and did before 1913 decide that it's better to borrow money from a privately owned entity and have to pay interest on it? Clearly it's a sweet deal for the bankers, but what's in it for the government? Why would the politicians agree to this? Well, it's very simple. Politicians don't spend their own money in office. They spend other people's money. And governments don't earn money. They can only tax or take money from someone and give it to someone else. So if you were a politician prior to 1913 and you wanted to spend money to do the things that got you voted into office, you'd have to raise taxes to generate the money. Well, every politician knows that if you were the one to raise taxes, you might not be around next election. So borrowing the money from a privately owned corporation is a way to get money without taxing the people directly. Now I say directly because here's the deception. Instead of a direct tax where the politicians were open about it and said, hey everybody, we're raising taxes, we have a system of money creation that still passes the burden on to taxpayers, but with a built-in mechanism called inflation, which is a hidden tax. It is the reason why movies no longer cost a nickel, and only a generation ago, bread was a quarter, and a new car cost $2,000. This means that as the money supply is artificially increased, without taking into account the natural equilibrium of supply and demand of what the money buys, which would normally keep prices low through competition, prices then rise, which brings buying power down. What that means in practical terms is your $5 which bought you 4 oranges last week only buys you 3 oranges this week. You still have your $5, but you only have 3 oranges. We humans only need money for food, clothing, and shelter. We don't need the money, we want what the money buys. It's all about the buying power. And the tax is hidden because we are trained to look at our $5 instead of what the dollar buys. So as the money supply artificially increases without the demand for goods, there's a lot of extra dollars floating around. And the sellers will sell at a higher price because the law of supply and demand says they can. So question, what do you have to do if you still want 4 oranges? Your only option is you have to earn money at a faster rate than you did before. Now for most people, this just means you have to work more hours. So since the Fed was created and almost 100 years of inflation later, the buying power of the dollar is down 96% of what it was when the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. This is also why it now takes 2 household incomes to sustain the same living standard when our grandparents could do it with 1. So yes, I just said the reason why both husbands and wives have to work full-time is because of the fractional reserve monetary system our government chose to adopt in 1913, which has a built-in tax called inflation. Now I want to be clear, whether the government prints the money itself, as it did prior to 1913, or the Fed prints the money. If money is printed at a faster rate than the law of supply and demand is dictating for the economy at the time, inflation will occur, and the American people will pick up the check with higher prices and decreased buying power. But there are 2 main differences. 1, see, government was created to serve the people, and one way it was supposed to do that is by creating and regulating its people's money supply. So if we, through our government, create the money ourselves, we don't have to pay interest on it. And 2, giving away the power to create and regulate the money supply to a for-profit organization invites major problems, not only for our economy as a whole, but if left unchecked and under the radar, like it's been for the last 3 generations worth of politicians, it can literally destroy the middle class of society, where a small percentage are way up here and everyone else is way down here. And it's happening now. Right now, 1% of the world's population owns over 40% of the world's wealth, and this is done on purpose by those who are in position to manipulate the system. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to back up a moment and show a clip from a documentary that will give some specific details and provide a visual illustration of what we talked about, reviewing the process of how money is created and borrowed, and it will introduce how money is expanded throughout the fractional reserve system.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them Treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt. And when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10%, or $1 billion, is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And, of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original 10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
So that's how the money supply is expanded. Fascinating, right? So why is this important to know? Why should the average person care to understand this stuff? Well, the first thing is it's important to understand that inflation is built into the system. So newsflash, if anyone ever tells you that inflation is some mysterious thing and it's just way too complicated for you to try to understand, they are lying to you. We know exactly what it is and what causes it. The second and more important thing is the system is designed to have winners and losers. It's built in on purpose. And guess what? The people who control the money supply can expand it and contract it in such a way that some lose and they win. Now, to help demonstrate this, we're going to go right back to it with a shorter clip from the same documentary that is going to take us a little further by introducing how the interest charged on the government debt is designed as the mechanism to transfer real wealth from the American people to the banks.
Now, so far we have discussed the reality that money is created out of debt through loans. These loans are based on a bank's reserves, and reserves are derived from deposits. And through this fractional reserve system, any one deposit can create 9 times its original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pull enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. As dysfunctional and backwards as all of this might seem, there is still one thing we have omitted from this equation. And it is this element of the structure which reveals the truly fraudulent nature of the system itself: the application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering, for the amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place.
So what Peter Joseph, the creator of that video, is saying is the amount of money put into circulation just isn't enough to cover the total debt, including the interest. He believes that the more we borrow, the more we have to borrow, so that the cycle will just go on and on. Now, Edward Griffin, author of this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, calls what Peter Joseph is describing as only a partial truth. He agrees that there is never enough money created to pay back all the interest, but disputes the idea that the only way to pay it back is to borrow more. And what he suggests is actually quite worse. Some people borrow more, but most people simply have to work more, like taking an extra part-time job to pay it off or to work overtime. This, of course, creates more winners and losers, as there is competition for these extra hours. So now, not only are we having to work more to keep up with inflation in order to continue to get our 4 oranges, but we now have to compete more to compensate for the deficiency of the amount of currency in circulation. So what Mr. Griffin is suggesting is that the design of the system is worse than simply creating perpetual debt. But that in fact the system is so designed to make people have to continuously work more and more, a system in which, and I quote, "a great mass of society works as indentured servants to a ruling class of financial nobility." Now that obviously sounds like an extreme, but if left unchecked, that's where it goes. What he is saying is that the system creates the need for a constant increase in labor throughout our lives, which is required in order to combat ever-increasing prices caused by inflation and the interest that can only be repaid by competing with others. And thus we have to work longer hours, which is why both husband and wife have to work to sustain the same living standard as our parents and grandparents. Borrowing the money to pay the debt is still an option, but it only delays the inevitable. Either way, we're trapped. All right, so here's a checkpoint. Does everyone understand what happens when you have to pay interest on something, yet the money you would use to pay that interest doesn't exist? The answer? Slavery. Because if the money doesn't exist, all interest is eventually paid by human effort. And if you're still not clear, I'll give you an example taken from Dr. Griffin's book to illustrate the point, though you have to understand that it took him a page and a half to do it. Example. Let's assume you are having a hard time paying back your bank loan, so you take on an extra part-time job. As you make your payments, the interest you pay on the bank loan is not counted as the principal and therefore remains as spendable money for the bank. The bank then hires you part-time to clean their floors. The result is that you earn the money to pay the interest on the loan, and the money you receive is the same money which you had previously paid. The same dollars go into the bank as interest, then out the revolving door as your wages, and then back into the bank as a loan repayment. And the next month you owe more interest and must submit to more labor. They might as well have said, "We won't charge you interest, just keep the floors clean, serf." Now, forgive me if I'm beating this point up a little bit, but if you understand this, then you'll understand what Henry Ford meant when he said this: "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." Former director of the Bank of England, Sir Josiah Stamp, said if you want to remain slaves of the bankers and pay for the costs of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and control the nation's credit. Bernard Latour, the founder of the European Union currency system, said greed and competition are not the result of immutable human temperament. Greed and fear of scarcity are in fact being created and amplified. The direct consequence is that we have to fight with each other in order to survive. So newsflash, it's a system problem. So politicians can argue all they want about how to solve the problem, but as long as they are offering solutions that are within the framework of the system and not addressing the system itself, it's just lip service. Not to say all politicians are not honestly and truthfully presenting solutions that they believe will make things better, only that they are treating the symptom instead of the cause. But remember, they don't really want to solve this problem, because if they did, they'd have to operate an honest money system. And if they operated an honest money system, being a politician would be a lot harder. Because if what got them voted into office ends up costing taxpayers more than what was anticipated, then the people would get rid of them. And thus, there would be no such thing as a career politician. So this is another element of the flawed system. Not only does it force us into economic slavery, but it handcuffs the politicians. I found a quote from the author Upton Sinclair that I think beautifully illustrates the point. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. And here's what Thomas Jefferson said on the subject. I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. He then said, after abolishing the central bank that existed during his presidency, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations which grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. But most importantly, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president that signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, said he regretted what he did. Watch this.
The year was 1913. Woodrow Wilson was president, and powerful banking interests who had been trying for years finally achieved their long-term goal of a silent coup d'etat by taking control of the American government. The first thing they did to accomplish their takeover was convince Secretary of State Philander Knox to lie to the American people and tell them that the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment, had been legally ratified by the states when it was not. The bankers knew that this tax would ultimately end up in their pockets. Because of this fraud, the American people were led to believe there was now a tax on their labor. Congress and the President are completely aware of this fraud, and it was even cited in a recent court case. That very same year, the bankers committed their second and by far the most diabolical fraud ever perpetrated on the American people by bribing senators to pass the Federal Reserve Act without the required constitutional amendment.
All in favor, say aye.
They did this during Christmas vacation, when many senators were home celebrating the holidays with their families. And that's how the unconstitutional Federal Reserve Act came into being. They were very clever, and they understood that whoever issued the money for America would control the government. The bankers won, and the American people lost, because most politicians will sell their soul for $1. And now the Federal Reserve could issue dollars legally. As Mayor Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." He knew that he and the other bankers would now control the laws of the nation. Government gave these bankers one of its most important powers, and now had to borrow money from them and pay interest to finance the government. So the American people were forced to lower their standard of living and pay a graduated income tax to the government, just so the government could give these bankers more profits. President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, later said, in regret, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority. but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men.
So, how we doing so far? Pretty crazy, huh? Now in the last clip, producer Aaron Russo hinted about how taxes are a part of the fraud, and taxes are a later subject. But before we can go forward, we have to go backwards first. Now the next thing to understand is giving a central bank the authority to control the nation's money supply is not a new problem. And it actually goes further back than 1913. The fact is that since our country was founded, who has controlled the nation's money supply has changed hands 8 times. The Federal Reserve is the 4th central bank to seize control of our nation's money supply. It has gone back and forth between the government issuing its own money, which is how it started, and a privately owned central bank, which is how it has been for almost 100 years, which is by far the longest stretch that any central bank has existed in our nation's history. So who are these people that keep gaining control over our nation's money supply? The clip showed names like the Morgans, the Warburgs, and the Rockefellers. But to really understand what these people are about, I'd like to put names aside for a moment and introduce a phrase that our 4th president, James Madison, coined when he spoke of these men. He called them money changers. What he thought of the money changers can be summed up from this quote. History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. So money changers are those that manipulate the quantity of money. So I'd now like to go back in time and explain why controlling the money supply in any form can not only make you rich, but how it provides incredible political influence. So I'm going to pull examples from our history. I ran across a documentary called Money Masters that told a story about how in the Bible it said that Jesus once drove the money changers out of the temple in Jerusalem. It also said it was the only time Jesus used force during his ministry. So what were the money changers doing in the temple? When the Jews came to Jerusalem to pay their temple tax, they could only pay it with the special coin, the half shekel of the sanctuary, a half ounce of pure silver, and was the only coin around that was pure silver, assured weight, and that didn't have the image of a pagan emperor. And therefore for the Jews, it was the only coin acceptable to God. But there wasn't very many of these coins. Now the documentary said that the money changers cornered the market on the Jews, then raised the price to whatever the market would bear. In other words, the money changers were making exorbitant profits because they held a monopoly on money, and the Jews had to pay whatever they demanded in order to pay their tribute to God. To Jesus, this totally violated the sanctity of God's house, so he forced them out. Now the documentary didn't say how the money changers cornered the market, but the only ways they could have done this was to either literally create the coins or somehow collect all of them. So here's my first opinion. I think they knew what they were doing and they created the money, which means they shaped the silver to create the coins they knew would serve their purpose. Now when the Jews paid their temple tax, they gave it to the church, not the money changers. So when I heard this story, I couldn't help but notice that in order for the money changers to corner the market, they had to partner with the church in order to make it mutually beneficial. They needed the church to collect the coins, and the church needed the money changers to create and regulate the supply. Now the story didn't mention this partnership, so it's my opinion that this relationship existed. But like today's relationship between the Fed and the politicians, the money changers in the temple had to have a partnership with the church. And this relationship might also explain why Jesus got so mad. Now, rewind even further to Rome 200 BC. The money changers were there too. Two different Roman emperors tried to reduce the power of the money changers. They did this by limiting land ownership to 500 acres and reforming usury laws, which means they put limits on the amount of interest you can earn. And guess what? Both emperors were assassinated. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar took back the power to coin money and minting coins for the betterment of all, and won the love of his people. As you can imagine, the money changers hated him, and some believe that this was the real reason for his assassination. What we do know as fact is that after his death came the demise of plentiful money, taxes increased, corruption increased, and usury and debased coin became the rule once again. Debased meaning a decrease in buying power, which is exactly what we're experiencing today. Now, if you remember the clip I showed that talked about the book Modern Money Mechanics, and how it mentioned that our current system uses a system called fractional reserve banking to create the money. They call it fractional because the banks are required to carry only a fraction of what they are actually lending out. At the time of this recording, this number is 14%, up from when the video said it was 10%. Now, I mentioned the fractional reserve system because this concept of lending out more money than you have was created when the goldsmiths came around about 1000 AD. They were the first bankers because they were the first to hold other people's gold in their vaults. They would then give the people paper receipts redeemable for gold upon request. But after a while, the goldsmiths realized that because confidence in the paper was so high, only a small fraction of depositors ever came in to demand the gold at any one time. So they started cheating the system. They discovered they could print more money receipts than there was gold. Then they loaned out this paper money and collected interest on it. And this was the birth of the philosophy of fractional reserve banking, which is earning interest on money you never had to begin with. An example is if they received $1,000 in gold from depositors, they could loan out $10,000 in paper without anyone knowing, and receive interest on the full $10,000 when they only had $1,000 in the vault. But here's where it gets interesting. In addition to realizing this was a way to gradually collect more and more gold, they discovered a way to speed up the process. How many of you have heard of the boom-bust cycle, also called the business cycle? Remember when I mentioned earlier how under fractional reserve monetary policy, there are winners and losers? Whether then or now, it's the same. Except the money changers don't call it boom and bust. They call it rowing the economy. And this is how they speed up the process of bringing money to them. Check this out. When they made money easier to borrow, then the amount of money in circulation expanded. Money was plentiful. People took out more loans to expand their business or buy bigger or new homes. But then the money changers would tighten the money supply. They would make loans more difficult to get, and the amount of money in circulation started to shrink. What would happen? Just what happens today. A certain percentage of people could not repay their previous loans, because after the money supply was shrunk, there was literally not enough money in circulation to repay their debt, and they simultaneously could not take out new loans to roll it over. Therefore, a certain percentage of people went into bankruptcy and had to sell their assets to the goldsmiths for pennies on the dollar. Only this time, the assets that the goldsmiths took were real. The same thing happens today. Now, up until this point, the money changers had to operate illegally. Back then, loaning money you didn't have was called counterfeiting. The Bank of England was the first time in our world's history when a bank partnered with the government. And today, the term legal tender means the government not only says that it's legal for a central bank to counterfeit the money, but we are all required by law to accept it. Fast forward to the Revolutionary War. Now, while there were several reasons why they wanted to fight for their freedom, this is what Benjamin Franklin said on the subject. The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the Revolution. So after the Bank of England attempted to pass their losses onto the colonies and came to collect taxes, as you can imagine, we said, hold on, wait a second, we broke away from you guys. We ain't part of that slave machine no more, okay? This is my corn. So ever since we won the Revolutionary War, the money changers have repeatedly attempted to take control of America's money supply, and succeeded on 4 different occasions. Now it's important to point out here that these money changers don't have any national affiliation or national loyalty. They're not European, they're not American, they're not anything. They operate outside of that thinking. All they see is opportunity. So here is a timeline of the 4 central banks in our nation's history. The Bank of North America lasted for 2 years. And 1783 was actually when we won the American Revolution, and it's when we immediately went to an honest money system. 8 years later came the second central bank, called the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States lasted 20 years. It was chartered for 20 years, and then it was set up for review before it could be renewed. But upon review, it was defeated. But the money changers had tremendous influence, and after only 5 short years, they succeeded again. The second Bank of the United States lasted 17 years, also on a 20-year charter, but Andrew Jackson campaigned his re-election on abolishing the central bank. Jackson exposed the central bank so much that this knowledge was practically common knowledge, and America did not see another central bank for 80 years. Just long enough for people to forget. And the Federal Reserve was born in 1913 and has been around for almost 100 years. So now I'd like to name names. There were 7 men who met in secret in 1910 on Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Brunswick, Georgia, and was owned by J.P. Morgan. They drafted the policies of the Federal Reserve Act in secret. Here they are. I included their names, but I show this mostly so you can see their job titles. You'll notice 5 are bankers, and the top 2 on the list hold government positions that dictate the nation's monetary policy. These men represented 1/6 of the world's wealth. And if you combine them with the Rothschilds of Europe, they controlled 1/4 of the world's wealth. And that is a conservative percentage. Now, before there was government, there were kings. The Rothschilds were the first family that lent money to kings in Europe throughout the 18th century before they helped create the Bank of England. By the late 1800s, the Morgans, Warburgs, Rothschilds, and Rockefellers all had their own orbiting dynasties. And they realized the only way to continue their growth, power, and influence was to form a cartel in the banking and finance industry. So what is a cartel? It is a group of independent businesses that join together to seek a monopoly over their industry, which reduces competition between themselves and thus increases profitability. But they had some problems to overcome. Now keep up with me, people. I'm going to say these details quick. But if you follow me, it's going to put the final piece of the puzzle of just how they've been able to pull this off for the last 100 years, where the previous 3 central banks failed. In order to first pass the debt on to the people, they had to first get the blame away from themselves. So they had to complicate everything so that people didn't want to understand it. So let's understand it, shall we? Here are the problems they had once the cartel was formed. The first problem was the sheer number of competitors that sprang up during this time. In the 1880s, almost every bank was a national bank, which means they were regulated by the government. In 1896, a mere 16 years later, the number of national banks shrunk from almost 100% down to 39%. And prior to 1913, which was the year the Federal Reserve was created, the number of national banks was shrunk to 29%. This means that over 70% of the banking industry was flooded with private banking competitors. The members of the banking cartel knew they had to reverse this trend if they were to ensure their monopoly. In fact, it was John D. Rockefeller who was quoted in saying, "Competition is sin." Now, the second problem was the competition from the free market interest rates that existed at that time. Free market meaning there was a natural balance between debt and thrift. Thrift meaning businesses were able to finance future growth out of profits rather than from having to go into debt. So to further explain the point, I'd like to now introduce the concept of the free market interest rate equilibrium. This equilibrium was when rates were low enough to attract serious borrowers who were confident of the success of their business ventures, but the rates were high enough to discourage loans for frivolous ventures or for which there were alternative sources of funding, for example, one's own capital. The balance between debt and thrift was also the result of a limited money supply. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the book Jekyll Island, as well as a documentary from Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman called Free to Choose, who both agree that it's an economic fact that if you leave certain things alone, like the supply of money, a natural equilibrium occurs, and competition has its opportunity to keep prices and interest rates competitive, and avoid things like monopolies and corporate favoritism. So a money supply that coincides with the supply and demand of goods and services promotes the balance of debt and thrift. By 1910, 3 years before the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, 70% of the American corporate growth came from thrift, meaning the majority of people did not have to go into debt to finance their growth. Okay, pop quiz. If the bankers make money by earning interest on what they loan, but 3/4 of the country is doing well enough to expand their businesses or get the things they want without having to borrow money, do you think the bankers like this? Yes or no? Well, if you base the answer solely on their actions when faced with this problem, then the answer is no. So there's the second problem. They needed to disrupt the free market because the free market promotes thrift. In fact, at this point, even the government was becoming thrifty. America had a growing stockpile of gold, we were systematically redeeming the greenbacks, and rapidly reducing the national debt. So we had an increase in private bank competition, free market interest rates, decreasing government debt, and decreasing personal debt. All wonderful things for the economy, but for the members in attendance at Jekyll Island, this was a problem. They knew these were threats that had to be eliminated. Okay, so let me ask you, do you think these folks were the type of people who would just stand around and let these trends continue? Yes or no? And again, if you base that answer by what they did, you know the answer is no. But what's also interesting is that they weren't the only ones. Bankers and other businessmen, including their banking competitors, also wanted to disrupt the free market system and tip the balance of interest rates lower to favor debt over thrift. To accomplish this, they needed to disconnect money from gold and increase the money supply. And of course, how do they do that? By creating it out of nothing and lending it into the economy. Now, despite these threats, there was something that the bankers feared even more than the first two problems already mentioned. Even if they were able to disconnect money from gold, disrupt the free market interest rates, and expand the money supply so that they could lend more, there was still one final piece of the puzzle that was still beyond their control. And as it turns out, the greatest threat wasn't from rivals or even private capital. How many of you have heard of a run on the bank? To use the goldsmith example I used earlier, if the goldsmith only has 1/10 of what he is actually loaning out, he's hoping consumer confidence stays high enough so no one wants to redeem the actual gold. If more than 1/10 of the people request the gold at any given time, the fraud is exposed. Back then, they also had to worry about currency drains, which were equally as devastating as a run on the bank. A currency drain works the same way, except instead of withdrawals, people would just write checks. People who received the checks deposited them into their bank. If that bank happened to be the same bank that the check was drawn from, then all was well, because no real money had to be removed from the vault. But if the recipient deposited the check in a different bank, then settlement between banks was demanded. Now, if there is an equal amount of deposits flowing between the opposite banks, then it could be corrected with simple bookkeeping. But if the flow was not equal, then one of the banks had to actually send money to the other to make up the difference. Now, if the amount of money required to send to the other bank exceeds a few percentage points of the bank's total deposits, meaning that it had to send over more than what it actually had in the vaults, the result is the same as a run on the bank, but it's called a currency drain. Now, the reason we need to understand what a currency drain is because in 1910, the most common cause of bankruptcy by a currency drain was caused by a loan policy that was more reckless than that of its competitors. More money was demanded from it by other banks because those banks kept lower reserves than their competitors so that they could loan out more money. It was dangerous enough lending 90% of the customer's savings, but some pushed it to 92, 95, or even 99%. After all, the more money they loaned, the more interest on the loans they collected. So the more loans they made, the more money they made, and therefore they pushed their reserve ratios as low as possible so they could loan out as much as they could. So the members of Jekyll Island realized that in order to avoid currency drains from the dangerous lending that they wanted to do, they needed to create a system, and they realized that if all banks were forced to issue loans at the same reserve ratio, then no major currency drains would ever occur. But here's the kicker. Under such a policy, the entire banking system itself could still collapse, but no individual banks would collapse. So here's the punchline. Under such uniformity, no individual bank could be blamed for failure to meet its obligations. The blame could then be shifted to the economy, or government policy, or interest rates, or trade deficits, or the exchange value of the dollar, or even as it did during the Great Depression, and blame capitalism itself. This, above all else, is the main deception that has allowed them to avoid the blame for all this time. Historian John Klein said, "The panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907 were in large part an outgrowth of reserve pyramiding and excessive deposit creation by reserve city banks. These panics were triggered by the currency drains that took place in periods of relative prosperity when bank failures were caused not by negative factors in the economy, but by currency drains on the banks which were loaned up to the point where they had practically no reserves at all." Now remember, the members of the cartel weren't the only ones that wanted to favor debt over thrift. So it was easy to use their influence and relationships throughout the financial sector to ensure that the majority of banks agreed that it was an acceptable business practice to create profits by dropping their reserve ratios to what they knew to be unstable levels as long as they all did it together. And since confidence in the system itself was the trigger to sustain or collapse it, guess what they did? As soon as they had enough people bought in, they simultaneously started spreading the word that the system is unstable and that people better go get their money while they still can. which caused the panics that not only destroyed all of their competitors, but allowed them to then present the political solution that what America needed was a central bank to help regulate the unstable banking world. And you remember this list of people who created the Federal Reserve in secret in 1910. Number 1 is Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, business associate of J.P. Morgan, and whose daughter in 1901 married the son of John D. Rockefeller Sr., joining by marriage into the family that was not only the world's pioneer of central banking, but was the wealthiest family in 2 continents. Aldrich helped not only draft the Federal Reserve in secret, but used his position as chairman of the nation's Monetary Commission to push the Federal Reserve through Congress as the solution to the problems that he, his colleagues, and his family had helped create. Only unlike the previous central banks, who were under review after 20 years, this central bank was formed into law without a charter. And that is how they deceived the country into accepting the 4th central bank that America has seen, and how they were able to pull off shifting the blame away from themselves for so long. The members of Jekyll Island knew that to avoid runs on the banks and currency drains, they had to create a system that would allow them to continue to make more promises to pay on demand than they could keep, find a way to force all banks to walk the same distance away from the edge, meaning the same reserve ratios, and when the inevitable disasters happened from loaning out too much money in an unstable system, they had to find a way to pass the blame away from themselves. Now, by making it appear to be a problem of the national economy, rather than of private banking practices, combined with its relationship with the government by charging interest on what it loans to the government, the door could then be opened for the use of tax money rather than their own funds for paying off the inevitable losses. And here is where we now see the birth and the true face of the IRS. The Federal Reserve, IRS, FBI, and Anti-Defamation of Character League were all created in 1913. Once the government agreed to pay interest on the money it borrows, the bankers knew they needed a method to pass their inevitable losses on to the taxpayers, and the IRS was the machine to do it. How many of you have seen the law requiring you to file your 1040? Well, the answer is none of you, because there is no law. The IRS is a corrupt system. Most people generally sense this, but they don't know for sure. Well, I'll tell you, they are ruled not by law, but by a mobster mentality. And if you don't believe me, see for yourself. I'm now going to show you a video clip from an interview with a former IRS commissioner who is also author of the tax code and who is a current IRS consultant. It's several minutes long, but it covers everything you need to know about the corruption of the IRS. Enjoy.
So I called Sheldon Cohen because he used to be the IRS commissioner. He wrote the tax code, and he was also general counsel to the IRS. He is a true expert, and I couldn't find a better person to answer my questions. He graciously agreed to my interview. The reason I'm doing this documentary is because there are many people in America today who believe that there's no law that requires them to pay an income tax or file a 1040. And there are many people going to jail for it, fighting over it.
The Internal Revenue Code is authorized by the 16th Amendment.
I think it should be clarified. I think government should be transparent to the people. Why doesn't the IRS commissioner sit down with them and just explain it in clear English? Why?
I don't think they really care. They don't think. I think they're just playing word games.
You don't think they're sincere people?
No, I don't think they're sincere people.
What does voluntary compliance mean? And why does the IRS code say it's voluntary to comply, not mandatory?
That's a word euphemism we use. We use voluntary compliance when we talk about traffic signals. Most people at 2 o'clock in the morning, do you stop at a red light?
Yeah.
Is there a cop there?
Sometimes I don't.
Well, I do, and most of us do. Most of us do.
Right.
But that's voluntary compliance.
That was a complete perversion of logic. Traffic laws state that it is mandatory to stop at a red light. The IRS code says it's voluntary to comply. Mandatory and voluntary are the complete opposite of each other. Yet he wants us to believe that they mean the same thing. So can the government criminally prosecute somebody of information put on their 1040?
Yes.
Right, so doesn't that violate the Fifth Amendment?
No.
But the Fifth Amendment says I don't have to do anything that incriminates myself.
Well, it doesn't incriminate you to put your income down.
But you said before I could be put in jail for it. The commissioner wants us to believe that although the IRS demands that you fill out the 1040 and you can go to jail for it, that they are not violating your Fifth Amendment rights of self-incrimination. That is absurd. Isn't it true that the word income is not defined anywhere in the Internal Revenue Code?
The law says that the government has a right to tax income from any source derived.
So, but the word income is not defined in the code. It just says income without a definition
That's right.
of what income is.
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah.
There are many different kinds of taxes. Well, how can an American citizen know what income is if the code doesn't define it? If they're paying an income
Because
tax...
the courts have all defined it.
Do you remember what constitutional attorney Edwin Vieira said?
The definition of income in the Constitution was given in the Eisner versus Montgomery case, and it turns on gains or profits that are made from some activity.
So the Supreme Court has ruled income is not wages, it's not labor, it's gain from corporate activity. I believe that a man's labor is his private property.
That's your view, but it's not the law.
The Supreme Court's even said your labor is your private property. When I go to work for somebody, it's a trade. It's an even exchange. I do some work, you give me some money.
In 1916, we had the Bruce-Shaber case and the Stanton case. And the Bruce-Shaber case and the Stanton case said that the 16th Amendment gave the government no new taxing power.
I'm not going to argue the niceties of that with you.
And it came up again in a case called Peck versus Lowe, where the Supreme Court said the 16th Amendment did not extend Congress's taxing power to any new or accepted subjects. In other words, if you weren't taxable before the 16th, you weren't taxable after the 16th.
Today I interviewed a juror, who sat on a case, and they found the person not guilty for lack of filing, okay? And I asked her why they found him not guilty. And she said because the IRS couldn't show us the law that made him liable to file a 1040.
All they need to do, if there is a law, is to show us the law, which, of course, they never did.
And the reason they didn't do it was why?
Because there is no law.
Title 26 requires you to file a return.
But doesn't Title 26 have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court decisions?
You're going to take a 1920 case and superimpose it on the whole Internal Revenue Code that was written after it? No, that's not...
I can't believe what I just heard. Rewind.
You're going to take a 1920 case and superimpose it on the whole Internal Revenue Code that was written after it? No, that's not...
Remember he said earlier the Internal Revenue Code was authorized by the 16th Amendment?
The Internal Revenue Code is authorized by the 16th Amendment.
Remember, the Supreme Court said the 16th Amendment did not give the government any new taxing power. These decisions have never been overturned. Let's listen further. Can the lower courts overrule the Supreme Court?
No.
How are they putting people in jail today for not paying a tax on their labor when the Supreme Court said they don't have to? Doesn't the IRS code have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court? That's my big question.
This is a waste of time.
Well,
because whatever I say, you're not going to believe.
He's right. I don't believe him. And neither should you. He wants us to believe we should obey the IRS code, which is being enforced in violation of the many Supreme Court decisions. If the Supreme Court made a decision...
Thank you, Aaron. I think we're finished.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohen, you're doing that.
Well, I'm sorry that you constantly re-argue the point. You're liable because the law says that you're liable, and the courts say the law says you're liable, and that's why you're liable.
You see, he's talking about the lower courts, who are not in compliance with the Supreme Court, as they have to be. Doesn't the court have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court has so held.
Where?
You caught me unprepared.
I'll come back.
Well, I don't want to do that.
But let me ask you a hypothetical question.
No. You're making silly arguments here.
Why is the Supreme Court decision a silly argument?
Well, because it's inapplicable.
That made my heart stop. He just said Supreme Court decisions do not apply to the IRS. That's the behavior you would expect from a totalitarian country, maybe China or Russia or Cuba. Not from America. They're just making up the law as they go along. Now I knew the tax honesty movement was right. The IRS thrives on intimidation and fear, not by law. It's no different than a criminal protection racket, using force to extract your money from you. Then the former IRS commissioner, now working at a prestigious Washington law firm, threatens me. Watch.
Aaron, you understand Yiddish. Cornish to helfen.
For those of you who don't understand Yiddish, that means nothing will help you.
Hello! So even though I mentioned taxes at the beginning of this presentation, I've come the long way around to this video so you can see the larger picture of how the IRS fits into the fraud of the Federal Reserve. Now I will also mention that this documentary came out in 2006, and Aaron Russo, the producer of that documentary, died of a heart attack in 2007. And I don't have to tell you my opinion of what I think really happened to him. But regardless, I'm sure you can see now that these people operate above the system. In fact, I'll bet the back of the dollar will have more meaning for you now too. But again, I digress. So there is no law requiring us to pay a tax on our labor. The Constitution says if I own a business or corporation and I have employees, I pay taxes on the profits, but if I'm the employee, I don't pay a tax on my wage. The money we give to the IRS goes directly towards the interest owed on the government debt to the Fed, which goes directly into the hands of the bankers. So not only are we dealing with inflation, which destroys our buying power, but we are paying an income tax to the culprits. Vladimir Lenin said, "The way to crush the middle class is to grind them between the milestones of taxation and inflation." If we get rid of the Federal Reserve, we don't need the IRS to collect money for them. So with the Fed gone, the first thing to go is the income tax that we are paying to the bankers. Now I'd like to take a moment and dispel a rumor, because some people will say, so what that it's illegal to give 15 to 35% of our hard-earned money to the IRS every year? Americans should all contribute so the government can provide for the general public, because that's what it was created to do. And you'd be correct. Only they are not using the tax we pay on our labor for the things we expect them to use it for. And it's all part of the deception.
I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. Death and taxes may be inevitable, but unjust taxes are not.
Now, Mr. Hanley, I'd like to ask you something. What does the government do with all the money we give them in taxes?
When President Reagan was elected, one of the first things that he did was appoint a blue ribbon panel of business people headed by Peter Grace, and is commonly referred to as the Grace Commission. And their job was to research all the various areas of the federal government and make a report. One of the quotes from the Grace Commission is, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual income tax revenues are gone before 1 nickel is spent on the services taxpayers expect from government.
If we pay the salaries of the congressmen and the senators, we're supporting them, aren't we?
Well, yes.
Yeah. Well, then why can't we list them as dependents and deduct them?
We've been brainwashed. People have been told, that you need this income tax system to fund government, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, my question is, well, if that's true, how did we fund government from 1776 to 1913?
The main purpose of the income tax is not to raise revenue, but to redistribute wealth and to control society.
A lot of people might say, well, gee, if there wasn't an income tax, what would happen to education? They don't understand that education is paid for the most part, out of state and local taxes, your property tax. People might say, well, how are we going to build and maintain our highways if there's no money coming into the government? We need our highways. There is a tax on every gallon of gasoline that people buy. Proceeds from the income tax do not pay for highway construction.
Every year you give the federal government a form that says, here's how all my money worked. If you lie, you could go to prison. So you're required to give them a financial statement that under, the force of law could put you in prison if it's not impeccable, right? And under the law, they're supposed to do the same. They're supposed to give you back a financial statement that says, here's what we did with your money. Except you comply and they don't. In fiscal 99, the Department of Defense had 1.1 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. The following year, they had 2.3 trillion of undocumentable adjustments.
Okay, so now to recap about the IRS. The income tax is unconstitutional. The IRS forces Americans to pay an income tax through fear, not law. And the most important, the government allows this because the IRS is the central bank's way of collecting on the interest that it loans to the government. So now that you understand this, watch this video of people who, like yourself, are beginning to wake up.
What's your name?
Jan Crafting?
Hi, Jan. I'm Aaron Russo. I produced the movie
Is this a joke? Am I gonna
No,
make
no,
you
no,
look
it's not a
foolish?
joke.
Okay.
No. I produced the movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and The Rose with Bette Midler, many movies, and I'm doing a feature film. And my film is about my quest to find out whether or not people pay income taxes. Do you pay an income tax?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a law that requires you to pay an income tax?
Have I ever read it? You mean in the page, black and white? No, no.
So you pay the income tax, I assume?
Of late. Well, actually, no, I didn't file last year, but I'm sorry, is this on film? No, I paid my tax.
My question to you is, have you ever seen a law that says you have to pay an income tax?
The law is that guy that wears that badge and a gun. That's the one that puts you in jail. That's the law.
Actually, I can't stand the IRS. They're evil.
Do you have any fear of the IRS?
Not really, because I'm Canadian.
I think it's actually unconstitutional, is what I've heard.
Right.
But to avoid any hassle, I pay it.
If there was no law and I wasn't afraid of them coming and taking me to jail, absolutely I wouldn't pay taxes.
Okay, then no, I wouldn't pay income taxes.
It's a no-brainer. You wouldn't pay.
I wouldn't pay it.
Why would anybody? Because that's what they tell us we must do, else we're bad Americans.
Would you pay it?
No.
Would you pay it?
No.
Why would you pay taxes if you don't have to?
The income tax is not legal because it would be a direct tax and it is not apportioned as the Constitution demands.
If it's against the Constitution, then why are we doing it?
So allow me to interrupt for a moment and draw attention to that woman's question. If it's against the law, then why are we doing it? Meaning paying an income tax. Do you remember the answer? The answer is in red. The government allows this because the IRS is the central bank's way of collecting on the interest that it loans to the government. 100% of the taxes we pay to the IRS goes towards the interest owed on the government debt it pays to the Federal Reserve. So now let's watch the end of that clip that shows all the taxes we pay before we get to the income tax. So if you're still with me, you know we've covered quite a bit. When I first began putting this presentation together, my biggest challenge was deciding what not to share, because the truth is that there's a lot more to this story. I was going to share with you something called the securitization chain, which was the system that led us into the housing crash of 2008, the bailouts that ensued, and the beginning of our current recession. Hindsight is 20/20, and we know exactly what caused it and who profited from it. I was going to share with you the implications of what is called stagflation, which is when interest rates are low and inflation is high. Why it's happening right now, how we've gotten out of it in the past, and when we will reach the point of no return. I was going to talk about the dollar as the world currency. I wanted to talk about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and how they fit into everything. But lastly, and most importantly, I was going to talk about some freedoms that we no longer have, why we no longer have them, and who took them away, as well as some of our freedoms that are on the verge of being taken away. However, despite me leading out the details of these topics, it is my final opinion that anyone who made it through this presentation now knows more about how our country really works and who is really pulling the strings than 9 out of 10 people you'll find out there. And not only do I hope you agree that that percentage has to change, but in your viewing of this presentation, it might have changed already. Now I'd like to leave you with a final thought, and that is that I'd like to point out how fragile a democracy really is, and to never take our freedoms for granted. Winston Churchill himself said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others." He, like our founding fathers, as well as many others, knew it is not a perfect system, and that there are methods and even stages of manipulation that can and have been implemented even beyond what I have discussed here. Just remember, if you heat the water slow enough around the frog, he does not realize he's about to boil. In my research, I've discovered that there is a prevailing struggle that exists. It exists behind the wars we have fought in the past, as well as the war we are currently fighting. It has lasted for hundreds of years, and it is a struggle that can only be fought with knowledge. I'm reminded of a story where a wise Roman senator said, "Why don't we put wristbands on all the slaves so that we can tell them apart from us?" And a wiser Roman senator said, "Because if they knew how many of them there were, they would revolt." So the prevailing struggle I've discovered to hold true throughout the centuries is the war between those that know and those that don't know.
Now pay close attention to this quote by David Rockefeller, and you'll understand what is happening in the world today and where the American people are heading as a nation. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But now, the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. David Rockefeller, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, actually believes that we would be better off if he and his bank of friends ran the world.
Do you see how he referred to himself? Ruled by an intellectual elite, he said. That's why it's a war between those that know and those that don't know. Because as long as they know how to manipulate society when the majority of the population is unaware that it's even happening, then they would be correct that they are the intellectual elite. Well, guess what? Now you know. The money changers have existed long before America came around. And they have a formula to rule the world. And if we let them, they will. But America is the key. If the Federal Reserve is abolished, and every president has the power to do this, the entire house of cards will fall. Not that the Federal Reserve is the only central bank we would have to deal with, because in truth, the Federal Reserve has brothers, sisters, parents, aunts, and uncles all over the world. But if the mass of American people realize this knowledge of what's going on, that knowledge would bring enough momentum to carry across oceans. And even if that is so, it would still not be the only thing that needs to happen for America to get back on track by any stretch of the imagination. And we can worry about those problems together. But as long as a central bank is pulling the strings, then it's their agenda that's getting pushed through, not the American people's. Our founding fathers understood the dangers of allowing a central bank to control the nation. And they warned us. But as time passes, people forget. And future generations have to be reminded. Now it's our turn to get really curious about what's been going on and restore America to what it is supposed to be. And no one else is going to do it for us. Thank you very much for watching and listening.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no secret is revealed. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Peace is gonna come once we start to learn. Yearn for understanding one another. Come journey with me. We more than sisters and brothers. We more like lovers. We complement each other. So let's take a trip around the world and see the beauty of Mother Earth. The birthplace of all race and many nations. Beautiful artworks and many faiths. A world with no hate, only love and no fate. Cause people are inherently great. So let's live for the babies, and maybe we could be able to put an abundance of food on everybody's table. And maybe we take a minute to think about the positive things that positive thought brings. Then we would be able to see that the world is what you allow it to be. So smile at the next person you see, who's the opposite to race, status, color, or creed. That's how you make a change in a world in need. But it's up to me if it is to be. So let's keep spreading love to every person you see, and we'll be.
The board of directors of the Federal Reserve System is chosen by the president from a list prepared by the bankers themselves.
The process of finding a Greenspan replacement is ongoing and is being managed by a small group of people responsible for coming up with a list of nominees.
It's important that whomever I pick is viewed as an independent person from politics.
All the power is in the people. And to the extent that government becomes alienated from the people, does things that people don't want, power is transferred until you finally come to a police state, totalitarian state, whatever word you want to give it, where the desires of the people really have no consequence. They go out and they vote. Doesn't make any difference which candidate they elect.
I'm a programmer. I worked for NASA, worked for ExxonMobil, worked for Department of Transportation.
Mr. Curtis, are there programs that can be used to secretly fix elections?
Yes.
How do you know that to be the case?
Because in October of 2000, I wrote a prototype for President Congressman Tom Feeney at the company I worked for in Oviedo, Florida, that did just that.
And when you say did just that, it would rig an election?
It would flip the vote 51-49 to whoever you wanted it to go to and whichever race you wanted to win.
And would that program that you designed be something that elections officials that might be on county boards of elections could detect?
They'd never see it.
So how would such a program, a secret program that fixes the election, how could it be detected?
You would have to view it either in the source code or you'd have to have a receipt and then count the hard paper against the actual vote total. Other than that, you won't see it.
Given the availability of such vote rigging software and the testimony that has been given under oath of substantial statistical anomalies and gross differences between exit polling data and the actual tabulated results, do you have an opinion whether or not the Ohio election, presidential election, was hacked?
Yes, I would say it was.
So in other words, there is absolutely no assurance whatsoever in anything with regard to these machines?
Absolutely none.
Anybody who trusts an electronic voting machine should have their head examined. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. I've never seen a full list of ownership for the Fed. I don't think anybody has.
The government works for a private bank, and the private bank works for its owners, the true masters.
People talk to me about, the issue of Republican versus Democrat, as if they don't get it. And I say, look, here's the way you get it. It's organized crime. All you do is you call the Republicans the Genoveses, and you call the Democrats the Gambinos. The people at the top, they treat it like a crap game, like it's their crap game, like they're making lots of money. Occasionally somebody at the table shoots each other, but the moment anything threatens their crap game, they all unite to protect it. They're both controlled by the same financial, economic, and corporate interests.
Once the banks get into the picture and they form a partnership with the government gives them the legal power now to create bank-issued money backed by the coercive power of government to require everybody to accept that bank money.
In the course of the last century, they have converted this nation from a nation of independent freeholders to a nation of employees. And they're just one step away from being serfs.
Most people spend the great bulk of their money for taxes, interest, and inflation. And all of that money goes to these two groups that comprise the cartel and their partner, the federal government. It's not a coincidence.
So if Congress used its legal authority to shut down the Federal Reserve System, the American people would be much better off.